Quiet people are often misunderstood. Some assume they're wise, others assume they're shy, others assume they're hiding something. But the Bible gives a much more surprising answer, and it's not what most people expect. Because the Bible never actually says that being quiet makes someone virtuous, but it also never says that being quiet makes someone weak. What it says is far more interesting. And by the end of this video, you may start looking at quiet people, including yourself, in a completely different way. Let's start with a question most people never think to ask. Why are some people quiet in the first place? We tend to assume we already know the answer. We say things like, they're introverted, they're shy, they're the thoughtful type. But those labels only describe what we see on the outside. They don't tell us anything about what's actually happening on the inside. And that distinction matters enormously when you begin reading what Scripture actually teaches. Because the Bible is not a personality assessment. It doesn't divide humanity into loud people and quiet people and assign moral grades accordingly. What it does is something far more searching. It looks behind the behavior. It examines the motive. It asks the question that external observation can never fully answer. What is the condition of the heart? Proverbs 21:2 puts it simply, "Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart." That verse is significant because it tells us something most people find uncomfortable. We are all capable of mistaking our own behavior for virtue. A quiet person can believe their silence is wisdom when it might actually be fear. A quiet person can believe their stillness is humility when it might actually be resentment. And none of us can fully see that about ourselves without some honest reflection. So the question the Bible is really asking is not, are you the quiet type? The question is, what is your silence doing inside you? Now, let's be clear about something before we go further. The Bible does say genuinely good things about people who hold their tongue wisely. Proverbs 17:28 is one of the most striking verses in all of Scripture on this topic. It says, "Even a fool is considered wise if he keeps silent, and discerning if he holds his tongue." That is not a gentle suggestion. That is a direct observation about human behavior. When a person remains quiet in a moment that would tempt others to react, something is communicated. Restraint suggests composure. Composure suggests depth. And depth is exactly what wisdom looks like from the outside. But notice what Proverbs does not say. It does not say that the fool becomes wise by staying quiet. The appearance of wisdom and the possession of wisdom are two very different things. And this is one of the most important psychological and spiritual truths in all of Scripture when it comes to silence. Quietness can be a mask. It can project something outwardly that does not reflect what is actually happening within. And this is where the Bible gets genuinely surprising. Think about James 11:9, the Levantine. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Most people read that verse and immediately think of quiet people as the model. But look at it more carefully. The instruction is not, be a naturally quiet person. The instruction is, practice restraint, practice listening, practice the discipline of not reacting before you have truly heard and understood. Those are not personality traits. Those are spiritual disciplines. Any person, regardless of how naturally talkative or naturally reserved they are, can either practice or neglect those disciplines. The quiet person who never listens, who sits in silence while dismissing everyone around them inwardly, is not following the wisdom of James. And the talkative person who speaks carefully, who thinks before they open their mouth, who chooses words that bring life rather than damage, may be practicing more of James's wisdom than they are given credit for. We need to let that settle for a moment. Being naturally quiet is not the same thing as being slow to speak in the way Scripture means it. One is a temperament, the other is a choice. Now let's talk about Jesus. Because if anyone demonstrates the spiritual depth of silence in the New Testament, it is him. In Luke 23, when Jesus stood before Herod, Herod asked him many questions. And Scripture records something that would have been unthinkable for most people in that moment. Jesus gave him no answer, not because he had nothing to say, not because he was afraid, but because Herod was not asking sincerely. Herod wanted entertainment. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted Jesus to perform. And Jesus refused to reduce himself to that. His silence was not weakness. His silence was discernment. He understood something that most of us only grasp in theory. Not every question deserves an answer, and not every audience deserves your words. There is a form of silence that comes from self-mastery, a form of quiet that reflects an understanding of the moment that goes beyond what most people can see. And that kind of silence is extremely rare. But the Bible also gives us examples of quietness that came from a very different place. Hannah, in 1 Samuel, is one of the most emotionally honest figures in all of Scripture. She is described as someone who prayed from the depths of her sorrow, silently, lips moving but voice not heard. When the priest Eli saw her, he assumed she was drunk. He misread her completely. Her silence was not composure. It was grief. It was the kind of pain that goes so deep that it can no longer find ordinary words. And what is remarkable about Hannah is that she did not pretend. She did not perform quietness as if it were peace. She brought her silence before God exactly as it was, broken, honest, desperate, and God heard her. That is a profoundly different form of silence than the silence of self-control. Hannah's quietness came from anguish, and the Bible does not shame her for it. It honors it. This tells us something important about the way God views the quiet that comes from pain. He does not demand that you appear composed before you come to Him. He does not require you to organize your emotions into articulate sentences before they are worthy of His attention. Sometimes the deepest prayers are the ones that cannot be spoken aloud. But now we have to look at something harder, because not all quiet people are quietly grieving, and not all quiet people are quietly wise. Some people are quiet because they are afraid. Fear-based silence is something the Bible addresses again and again, often in ways that are less comfortable than we might expect. When the disciples were afraid during the storm on the sea, Jesus did not praise their silence. When Peter fell silent and denied knowing Jesus, his quietness in that moment was not wisdom. It was the failure of courage in a critical moment. There is a silence that comes from not wanting to be seen, not wanting to be exposed, not wanting to risk the consequences of being honest. And the Bible is consistently careful to distinguish that kind of silence from the silence of strength. Proverbs 29:2-5 makes the contrast plain. Fear of man will prove to be a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is kept safe. Fear keeps people quiet in ways that slowly become destructive. Not just to themselves, but to the relationships and communities around them. The person who witnesses injustice and says nothing because they do not want the social friction. The person who knows a truth that needs to be spoken, but swallows it because they are afraid of how it will land. The person who retreats into silence every time a difficult conversation is needed because conflict feels unbearable. That kind of quietness is not a virtue, it is a trap. And the Bible is compassionate about it because fear is deeply human, but it does not celebrate it. Then there is the silence that is harder still to talk about, the silence of resentment, the quiet that is not peace, but a cold war, kept just beneath the surface. Most people have experienced this in some form. The person who stops speaking in a relationship, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are punishing someone with their absence. The colleague who grows quieter and quieter as bitterness accumulates. The family member who becomes unreachable behind a wall of pleasant-sounding non-answers. This is silence as a form of control. It is not passive, it is active. And the Bible is clear that unresolved bitterness in the heart is corrosive, regardless of how still the surface appears. Hebrews 12:15 warns of a root of bitterness that springs up and causes trouble, defiling many. The image is agricultural, something underground, not visible from the surface, but growing, spreading, affecting everything around it. Silence can be the soil in which that root grows unchallenged. When we stop naming what we feel, when we stop bringing grievances into the open with honesty and grace, the things we leave unspoken do not disappear. They deepen. Now let's talk about something that often gets missed in conversations like this. The Bible does not just call people to silence, it also calls people to speak. Abigail, in 1 Samuel 25, is one of the most striking examples of a person who understood exactly when silence needed to end. Her husband Nabal had foolishly insulted David and put the entire household at risk. Abigail did not wait. She did not stay quiet and hope the situation resolved itself. She acted immediately, gathered provisions, rode out to meet David, and spoke with a clarity, a humility, and a wisdom that caused David to stop in his tracks. Her words saved lives, and they came from a person who clearly understood how to read a moment. She was not reckless. She was not impulsive. She knew when the time for quiet action had come and when the time for direct words had come, and she responded accordingly. That is what wisdom actually looks like. Not permanent silence, not permanent speech, but the discernment to know which one the moment requires. Ecclesiastes 3 makes this rhythm explicit. There is a time to be silent and a time to speak. That verse is often quoted as if it is a reassurance to quiet people that their silence is always acceptable, but read it again. It is equally a call to speak when speaking is what the moment demands. Wisdom is not a preference for quietness. Wisdom is the ability to read a situation accurately and respond to it truthfully. Now let's come back to the beginning. We started with the question, society is always asking about quiet people. Are they wise or are they hiding something? And by now, you can see that the Bible's answer is, it depends entirely on the heart behind the silence. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is described in Luke 2 as someone who treasured all these things and pondered them in her heart. There is a kind of quietness that is contemplative and faithful, a quietness that takes the significant things in life seriously enough to sit with them, to hold them carefully, to let understanding develop over time rather than rushing to conclusions. That is not avoidance. That is not fear. That is a form of inner faithfulness, a life being lived deeply rather than just loudly, and it is a quality the Bible clearly honors. But here is the thing that perhaps matters most as we come to the end of this conversation. The Bible does not grade us on our volume. It does not reward the naturally quiet person simply for being quiet. It does not penalize the naturally expressive person simply for having a lot to say. What it looks for, consistently, across the whole of Scripture, is the condition of the heart. Is your silence coming from a place of honest reflection and self-mastery? Or is it coming from fear or pride or unresolved pain that you have never brought into the light? Is your speaking coming from a genuine desire to bring truth and life to a moment? Or is it coming from the need to be heard, to be right, to control what other people think of you? These are not comfortable questions. But they are the questions the Bible is constantly asking. Not, are you loud or quiet, but what is happening inside you? What is your silence revealing about your trust in God? What is your speech revealing about the condition of your heart? The person who has learned to sit in genuine stillness, who has dealt honestly with their fears, who has brought their grievances into the open rather than letting them fester, who speaks when speaking is needed and holds back when restraint is wiser, that person reflects something real. Not a personality type, a character formed over time by honest self-examination and genuine faith. That is what the Bible is pointing toward when it speaks about wisdom and silence and the courage to speak. Not a temperament, a transformation. The Bible doesn't ask whether you're loud or quiet. It asks what kind of heart your words or your silence are revealing, and that is a question worth sitting with for a while.